Okay, let's go on to chapter 14. It's getting exciting. I've got my Malia bracelets on. Pod did not speak until they reached the sitting room, nor did he look at her. He had had to scramble after him as best she might. He had ignored her efforts to help him shut the gates, but once, when she tripped, he had waited until she had got up again, watching her. It seemed almost without interest while she brushed the dust off her knees. Supper was laid, and the ironing put away, and Homily came running in from the kitchen, surprised to see them together. Pod threw down his borrowing bag. He stared at his wife. "What's the matter?" faltered Homily, looking from one to the other. "She was in the night nursery," said Pod quietly, "talking to that boy." Homily moved forward, her hands clasped, trembling against her apron. Her startled eyes flicking swiftly to and fro. "Oh, no," she breathed. Pod sat down. He ran a tired hand over his eyes and forehead. His face looked heavy, like a piece of dough. "What, now what?" he said. Homily stood quiet, still, bowed over her clasped hands, and stared at Arrietty. "Oh, you never," she whispered. They are frightened, Arrietty realized. They are not angry at all. They are very, very frightened. She moved forward. "It's all right," she began. Homily sat down suddenly on the cotton spool. She had begun to tremble. "Oh, whatever shall we do?" She began to rock herself very slightly to and fro. "Oh, Mother, don't," pleaded Arrietty. "It isn't so bad as that. It really isn't." She felt up the front of her jersey. At first, she could not find the letter. It had slid around her side to the back, but at last she drew it out, very crumpled. "Look," she said, "here's a letter from Uncle Hendry. I wrote to him and the boy took the letter." "You wrote to him?" cried Homily, on a kind of suppressed shriek. "Oh," she moaned and closed her eyes. "Whatever next? Whatever shall we do?" And she fanned herself limply with her bony hand. "Get your mother a drink of water," Arrietty said Pod sharply. Arrietty brought it in a sawed-off hazel shell. It had been sawed off at the pointed end and was shaped like a brandy glass. "But whatever made you do such a thing, Arrietty?" said Homily more calmly, setting the empty cup down on the table. "Whatever came over you?" So Arrietty told them about being seen that day under the cherry tree and how she had kept it from them not to worry them, and what the boy said about dying out, and how, more than important, how imperative it had seemed to make sure that Hendrys were alive. "Do understand," pleaded Arrietty. "Please understand. I'm trying to save the race." "The expression she uses," said Homily to Pod under her breath, not without pride. But Pod was not listening. "Save the race," he repeated grimly. "It's people like you, my girl, who do such things sudden-like, with no respect for tradition, who'll finish us borrowers off once and for all. Don't you see what you've done?" Arrietty met his accusing eyes. "Yes," she said falteringly. "I've gotten in touch with the only other ones still alive. So that," she went on bravely, "from now on we can stick together." "All stick together," Pod repeated angrily. "Do you think Hendry's lot would come to live back here? Can you see your mother emigrating to a badger set 2 fields away, out in the open with no hot water laid on?" "Never," cried Homily, in a full, rich voice, which made them both turn and look at her. "Or do you see your mother walking across 2 fields and a garden?" went on Pod. 2 fields of crows and cows and horses and whatnot, to take a cup of tea with your Aunt Loopy, whom she never liked much anyway." "But wait," he said, as Arrietty tried to speak. "That's not the point. As far as all that goes, we're just where we was. The point," he went on, leaning forward and speaking with great solemnity, "is this. That boy knows now where we live." This is Arrietty showing them the letter. "Now the boy knows where they live." "Oh, no," said Arrietty. "I never told him that I..." You told him, interrupted Pod, about the kitchen pipe bursting. You told him how all our stuff got washed away to the grating. He sat back again, glaring at her. He's only got to think, he pointed out. Arrietty was silent, and Pod went on. That's a thing that has never happened before, never in the whole long history of the borrowers. Borrowers have been seen, yes. Borrowers have been caught, maybe. But no human being has ever known where any borrower lived. We're in very grave danger, Arrietty, and you've put us there, and that's a fact. Oh, Pod, whimpered Homily, don't frighten the child. Nay, Homily, said Pod. More gently, my poor old girl, I don't want to frighten no one, but this is serious. Suppose I said to you, pack up tonight, all our bits and pieces. Where would you go? Not to Hendrary's, cried Homily, not there. Pod, I couldn't never share a kitchen with Loopy. No, agreed Pod. Not to Hendrary's, and don't you see for why? The boy knows about that too. Oh, cried Homily in real dismay. Yes, said Pod, a couple of smart terriers or a well-trained ferret, and that'd be the end of that lot. Oh, Pod, said Homily, and began to tremble. The thought of living in a badger set had been bad enough, but the thought of not having even that to go to seemed almost worse. And I dare say I could have got it nice in the end, she said, providing we live quite separate. Well, it's no good thinking of it now, said Pod. He turned to Arrietty. What does your Uncle Hendrary say in the letter? Yes, said Homily. Where is this letter? It doesn't say much, said Arrietty, passing over the paper. It just says, tell your Aunt Loopy to come home. What? Exclaimed Homily sharply. Look at the letter upside down. Looking at the letter upside down, come home? What can he mean? He means, said Pod, that Loopy must have set off to come here, and that she never arrived. Set off to come here, repeated Homily, but when? How should I know, said Pod. It doesn't say when, said Arrietty. But, exclaimed Homily, it might have been weeks ago. It might, said Pod, long enough anyway for him to want her back. Oh, cried Homily, all those poor little children. They're growing up now, said Pod. But something must have happened to her, exclaimed Homily. Yes, said Pod. He turned to Arrietty. See what I mean, Arrietty, about those fields? Oh, Pod, said Homily, her eyes full of tears. I don't suppose none of us will ever see poor Loopy again. Well, we wouldn't have anyway, said Pod. Pod, said Homily, I'm frightened. Everything seems to be happening at once. What are we going to do? Well, said Pod, there's nothing we can do tonight, that's certain. But have a bit of supper and a good night's rest. He rose to his feet. Oh, Arrietty, wailed Homily suddenly. You naughty, wicked girl. How could you go start all this? And how could you go and talk to a human being? If only... I was seen, cried Arrietty. I couldn't help being seen. Papa was seen. I don't think it's all as awful as you're trying to make out. I don't think human beings are all that bad. They're bad and they're good, said Pod. They're honest and they're artful. It's just as it takes them at the moment. And animals, if they could talk, would say the same. Steer clear of them. That's what I've always been told. No matter what they promise you, no good ever really came to no one from any human being. They say human being instead of human being. Okay, that was chapter 14. Next is chapter 15.